Welcome to Inside Voices, a Real Red Magazine Between the Pages podcast. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Robert Gwaltney.
And I'm Jeffrey Dale Lofton. And we are so excited to enter into conversation with author Neema Avashia. Neema, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so lovely to be here with you both.
Thank you. Before we begin, I want to share a little bit about you with our listeners. So Neema was born and raised in southern West Virginia to parents who immigrated to the United States from India. And she has been a history and civics teacher in the Boston Public Schools since 2003. And her essays have appeared in The Bitter Southerner, Catapult, Kenyon Review Online, and elsewhere. And her memoir, Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place, was released to much acclaim in March 2022. She's also received quite a bit of recognition. She is a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award for Lesbian Memoir Biography. She's a finalist for the 2022 New England Book Award, also Book Riot 2022 Best LGBTQ Plus Memoir, and a New York Public Library Best Book of 2022.
Wonderful. And a lot of people are saying some wonderful things about your memoir, Neema. And I'm just going to share a few of these things. Anna Claire Weber from White Whale Bookstore says the following: an essential text to add to the new canon of Appalachian writing, a compassionate and rigorous memoir of the author's experience growing up as a queer Hindu child and teenager in a small community of West Virginian Indians. Another Appalachia is a bright and deeply empathetic portrait of a complicated place, a place that Neema Avashia allows to be multifaceted in the way it deserves. This is what Morgan Jenkins, author of This Will Be My Undoing, Living at the Intersection of Black, Female, and Feminist in White America, has to say. Another Appalachia is a breath of fresh air, a work that the public is in dire need of reading. Wide and expansive is the land the author calls home. This essay collection subverts the mainstream's hyperfocus of white male-dominated narratives from rural America and commands your attention from the first page to the last word. Congratulations on all that wonderful praise, Neema.
Thank you. It's kind of amazing to hear it all in one place. I don't think I've ever heard anybody go through it quite like that before.
Well, we are glad to help you through that.
It's pretty lovely.
Neema, you chose to tell your story as a series of essays, a choice that works incredibly well, I'll add. Will you tell us a bit about why you chose that form? Did it provide more creative freedom? Did you feel like a bit like a diarist in the course of writing another Appalachia?
I mean, I would have to say to start that I didn't know I was writing a book when I started. I knew that I was trying to map a set of experiences because really this book, in large part, happened because of another book. And that book was J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, which was published in 2016. And I was living up here in Boston, and all these people were coming up to me and being like, oh, I just read this book about where you're from, and I feel like I understand it in a whole new way. And I had read that book and been pretty upset about 30 pages in by a lot of things, by the fact that there's no acknowledgement of queer folks in Appalachia. There's no acknowledgement of immigrants in Appalachia. There's no acknowledgement of Black folks in Appalachia. And also there's this narrative that sort of ascribes all of the struggles of Appalachia to the people who live there. There's this sort of culture of poverty narrative that underpins that book that I don't fundamentally agree with. Like, I don't think people in Appalachia are somehow culturally deficient, and that's the reason why people are struggling. I think government and industry have really worked together to abandon a region of our country. So I had all these feelings about this book. I didn't have anywhere to put them. And I just was kind of like, I need to start writing these things down, right? This person has rendered me invisible. Before that book, when people asked me where I was from and I told them Appalachia, like, I got a lot of disbelief, but just kind of shrug it off as like, this is just a thing about me that I'll always explain. And then seeing a book that so willfully erased so many people kind of made me realize that there's like a real harm in not having a counter narrative. That there's a need for counter narratives that assert our existence. We can't let people define the region for us. We have to assert our existence within it. So the initial writing I was doing was just trying to assert that existence. Like, how do I show you that we were here? And then the essays that started coming out were really based on questions. So like a big question that I think about in the book is like, what does it mean to love a place that doesn't always love you back? Each essay is kind of looking at one of those questions, but I don't have answers. They're just attempts to explore the questions and invite other people into those questions with me and say, hey, is this your question too? Is this a thing you struggle with too? Let me try to show you the things I'm thinking about in my life relative to this question. And maybe if I show you what I'm thinking about, it helps you to make meaning of that question for yourself. I think that sometimes with memoir, there's an expectation that you have an answer. They sort of like lived through it. You've kind of gone through the whole experience and you have clarity at the end about what that experience meant. I don't feel like I have that clarity. I think I have lots of questions. I think I I essayed, right? That's what the word essay means, is to sort of like launch forth into the question. So I essayed out into these questions. And the book is a snapshot of where I was with those questions when I published it. Even since then, I feel like my answers to those questions have shifted and changed in some ways. But ultimately, I really feel like the essay form allows you to ask questions without having to answer them necessarily. It's enough to ask it and to think about it and to let other people think about it with you. And I find that to be a really freeing form, because the biggest questions I have don't have answers. So I appreciate the ability to write about them without feeling pressured to answer them.
Yeah, well, that's really what writers do, isn't it? They spark conversation about important things so that people can think about them.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that you don't assert that you have all the answers, if any answers, just your point of view. This is an excerpt from the essay, 9 Forms of the Goddess. I experience a double loss each fall, missing both the mountains of my childhood and the many mothers who played a role in raising me there. Talk about this quote, Neema. I think you've already touched a little bit on your motivation for writing your memoir. But talk a little bit about this quote, what it means to you, along with the reconciliation of loss.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a lot of grief and loss in this book. Loss of a place that I love dearly. It doesn't really exist anymore, right? It's a construct in my mind, but as it exists in the present day, it doesn't look anything like the place where I grew up, and it doesn't feel like it either. Loss of a community that I was deeply connected to, that again is no longer really in place. Most folks have left and moved. And I think the third piece is that really, for me, the sort of like more clearly, like my queer identity has surfaced and has become like probably the salient driver of my adult life, the further I found myself from my Appalachian and my Desi identities, because there's so much less space in either of those places for queer people. And so I think there's grief there too, which is that the choices I've made in adulthood to marry a partner of the same sex as me, to have a child with that partner, to kind of choose to live in a community in Boston that is a very queer community. Each of those choices sort of like puts more distance between me and those communities from my childhood. And so there's a way in which I think in this writing, it's grieving that loss, which is like, I don't know how to be all three of those things at the same time. I haven't totally figured out how to be queer, Appalachian, and Indian and feel permission to be all three of those things in each of those spaces. And so I think that grief kind of drives a lot of that writing about this sort of like place and people that I feel like I've kind of lost.
Thank you.
Yeah. You talk about community, and so here's a copy of the cover of the book, and I love the photograph. I love that it shows your family, and another Appalachia is as much about you as it is the cares and hardships of your family and your community, both in Appalachia and in Boston. So what was behind your decision to tell this kaleidoscope of stories and not simply your own story?
I think a big part of that was wanting people outside of Appalachia to understand. I feel like so much of, and I think this is true for folks who live in the South too. I think Appalachia and the South share While they are not the same, they share some overlapping experiences and identities. And I think one of them is that people outside those regions really view them from this very flat and unnuanced place. And don't really extend grace to people who live in those places, and don't really seek to understand why they might be making the choices they make, or what leads people to vote the way they do, or what leads people to engage in the ways they engage or don't engage. And so part of me felt like I could, as a writer, pull people outside closer and show them these people who had been so important to me. And in some cases, show them relationships that were just joy. And in some cases, show them relationships that are more complicated and harder, but where like I'm doing a lot of work to try to understand, and I want them to do that work too, right? I'm trying to model, like, we have to try to understand one another. We may not agree with each other. We may not always come down on the same side on an issue, but like, if we can't find a way to at least recognize and understand why someone's doing what they're doing, we will never find our way out of this moment. There's no way to find a way back to one another that doesn't involve acknowledging someone else's humanity and understanding why they're doing what they're doing, even when what they're doing is erasing your humanity, which is incredibly painful. I feel like the number of times I talk to queer folks in Appalachia about the fact that like we feel like we're constantly extending that grace, but it doesn't come back, is a really very painful and real thing. And I also don't know another way. I don't know a way that doesn't involve extending grace, even when you're not getting it back. And so I think that my hope was that if I showed folks, the people in my community who played such a big role in making me who I am, who shaped so much of my adult identity, who created home for me, it maybe would push them to just hold those folks with a little bit more nuance than the mainstream narrative about Appalachia allows for.
Yeah, there's such a
go ahead, Jeffrey.
And I was going to say, it's such a generous approach to talking about, the community around you. Grace, you use the word grace. I add generosity to it as well.
Absolutely. And so you've navigated several worlds, Desi, Appalachian, queer. What's been the reaction from these communities to your memoir, Neema?
It's been different from different spaces. I think that for my Desi elders, me having opinions, writing them down, and then publishing them is not an easy thing. It's just not, really isn't done. Even if you look, I mean, it's sort of becoming more the case, but by and large, in the generation before me, Desi folks did not write nonfiction, they wrote fiction. Right? There was always this need to create a little bit of space. And that space kind of was a buffer. Like, it prevented people from sort of shaming you for speaking a truth that needed to be spoken. So they're I like to joke that my aunties, they say, "Oh, you're so honest. You can't help it. You're just honest." And honest is like a disease, right? Honest is not like, it's a chronic illness. It's something that like they see that it exists about me, and they are sad that I'm so honest. But for their kids who are my generation, I think that there's some real freedom in seeing questions get asked, and seeing sort of both our community rendered on the page, which I think for a lot of us, we never thought we'd see. But also there are real issues facing our community. South Asian young people's mental health is a real crisis in this country, and it's not something that's getting better by not talking about it. And so although talking about it is hard and people don't necessarily want us to talk, I think that talking is important. And so sort of trying to push back and say, no, but we have to have these conversations, has actually opened some space with people that I think has been important. I think with Appalachian folks, I had a lot of anxiety that I have lived outside of Appalachia for as long as I lived there at this point. It's half and half. And so I really worried that people were going to feel about my book the way I felt about J.D. Vance's book, which was like, this doesn't resonate. This is false. This doesn't ring true. And I tried really, really intentionally to just cleave as closely to my own experience as I could. I wasn't trying to make broader claims. I wasn't trying to say anything more about Appalachia than just like my particular relationships and identity. But it, a reader can still read it how they read it and experience it the way they experience it. And what's been so surprising is how many people in Appalachia have said, I didn't think I had anything in common with you. I'm the opposite of you in my identity. And yet, like, I kept finding myself in your book, which has been really, really powerful. And I think speaks to how specificity can actually create opportunities for connection. That when you don't try to talk about more than just your specific experience, you actually invite people in to think about where they land in relation to it. And probably the most powerful response has been from queer Appalachian folks, who just continually just bowl me over with the way in which they sort of meet my vulnerability with their own. Like I go to tiny bookstores in tiny Appalachian towns, and there are young queer people showing up, and their heart's just like on the outside of their chest, and they're like, this is my favorite book. I've never read a book like this before. I never thought anybody would have my questions. Like, it helps me so much to feel not alone, to like see you write about these things. And that, I just feel like I'm kind of on the verge of tears all the time when I think about that. When I think about like what it means for young people to have a book that they feel like mirrors them in some way. And also what it means that there are people who want to take those books away from them. Because I think when you are a queer kid growing up in a small place, sometimes a book is the only mirror. And so the idea that folks would want to take that away just kind of feels like such a cruelty. In terms of like how important it is for young people's identities and what it does to them when we take mirrors away from them.
Agreed.
Something you said a moment ago sparks me to want to ask a probing question. So another Appalachia is deeply, above all, it's a deeply moving human story. But it's, as you touched on, it's a compelling story of social injustices and intransigence. How did you find that balance, that right balance to tell that?
I think, I think this sounds cheesy maybe, but when I look at sort of like the way in which we're polarized in this moment, or way that we have been polarized, because I think it's been done to us, it really feels to me like it's about narrative. So politicians are offering very flat narratives to describe people in this country, and that's left and right. It doesn't matter where politicians exist on the political spectrum. They are getting elected. They are making their careers on pitting us against each other, and on offering these like really flat caricatures of people that make it so we write people off. Like, I don't have to agree with anybody. I don't need to call them a deplorable. I also don't need to call them a snowflake. Like, neither of those things is helpful. Neither of those things is helpful. It doesn't serve any of us. It doesn't serve any of the people who are being described by those terms. And the politicians who are doing it aren't really helping any of us. They're helping themselves get elected, but it's not helping us as a nation to figure out, like, what do we do about our biggest problems? Because the truth is, the answers to our biggest problems exist in the conversation that happens between us. And in figuring out, like, how does my experience line up with and not line up with your experience? And like, what do we do to figure out where we go from here, given our different experiences? I think that part of what I hoped in writing a book that is personal, but also political, is that the hope for countering polarization is in the personal narrative. It's that, like, you can see people as fully human on the page in a way that you're not being given permission to in a lot of other parts of life right now. And that maybe if you can see that humanity rendered on the page, it makes you think differently about that person or that place when you encounter it in the rest of the world. I kind of think it's the only hope we have right now, is that the narrative is the thing that can be the counter, that sharing specific experiences that humanize people is a way to combat narratives that exclude people or blame people or shame people. I really think the personal narrative is maybe the space where you can push back against that a little bit. And that might be naive. I don't know. I don't know another solution. So that's the one I've kind of come down to,
I completely agree. I don't think that you're naive in your thinking. I do think that really is truly the only way is through narrative.
Yeah, I mean, because narrative is being used right now. It's just being used in like the wrong way, right?
Right. It's being weaponized.
That's right. That's right.
I'm really interested in hearing you talk a little bit about inequity, what it means to you, particularly regarding race and education, specifically what you experienced growing up in West Virginia and what you've also encountered in Boston as an educator.
They're very different experiences in some ways. I think that the main way I would characterize my existence or my education in West Virginia was there was so much silence about so many things. I grew up 60 miles from Blair Mountain, which is the site of the largest interracial labor solidarity struggle in American history. And we never talked about it. Booker T. Washington was born in a slave cabin 15 miles from my house. And no one ever talked about the fact that there was slavery in West Virginia, right? The narrative was, well, we're good because we broke up with Virginia and we stayed with the North, right? But no acknowledgement of like our state's history of racial oppression and injustice. Just was like real silence. Similarly, I think around queerness, that was the case. There was just so much silence. And I think in that silence, it meant we never reckoned with anything, right? So when I see the West Virginia legislature in this past session passing laws that they call an anti-racism bill, but it's really like an anti-racism bill because what they want is you're not allowed to talk about race in school. My response is, well, like no one was already talking about race in school. Like you're making it illegal now, but like it already wasn't happening. It's never happened. And the reason why we keep repeating these cycles is because we never reckon with this past history. And so that silence, I think, is the driving sort of way I think about inequity in my education growing up, is that for young people who came from those communities, for queer kids, for Black kids, for kids of color, like they were just erased from the history books and from the narrative. They didn't exist, right? Even if they actually physically existed, they sort of were gaslighted into thinking like we don't matter and we don't exist. I think in Boston, where I teach now, there is way more visibility and sort of vocal awareness around issues of race and racism and injustice in all kinds of ways. But the structural nature of inequity comes down on kids in ways that are really, really hard. So you drive 5 miles out of Boston and you hit Newton, and Newton North High School was built in the last 10 years, and it was like a $200 million build. They have the most beautiful library, they have athletic facilities, they have all these things. And then we have kids in the city of Boston going to schools with like that leak, the roofs leak, there's mold in the walls. The furniture is broken. Like that experience, that visible experience of segregation and economic segregation, I think is very different actually in the North than it is in the South. It's a strange phenomenon that people in the North don't want to talk about, but actually like Brown versus Board of Education forced the South to think differently about how they funded their schools. And so school funding in most Southern states and in Appalachia all the funding goes to the state level and then it gets distributed out from there. Whereas in the state of Massachusetts, school funding is property tax based. So whatever city you live in, whatever town you live in, like that money gets hoarded right there. And so you see that play out in a much different way here. The sort of like level of inequity community to community is so discrepant in a way that's really different from where I grew up.
Interesting. Thank you for that.
Neema, we talked about how you tell stories of other people alongside your own, how you get inside the hearts and minds of those folks. So you describe people, I'm going to sort of go further into that. You describe relationships involving people who would appear to hold, political and human rights views that are very different from your own. So talk to us about how you get inside them, how you understand them and portray them with care and affection. I mean, is it the feat of mental gymnastics that it seems to be?
It definitely has taken a lot of work. But I think I think the thing that that I don't doubt is the love. Like, I don't think that I invented the love. I don't think that that feeling was false. And so then the question that arises is like, well, if that feeling is real, then like, what has happened here? How did we go from this deep love and respect to like not even being able to have a conversation? That isn't because of anything we as individual people did. That's something that's been done to us. Because that, like, when you have deep love with people, like, if it were like a rupture that had happened in the context of your relationship, like I think you know, right? But to see such profound love just get kind of rendered invisible, I mean, to me, I have to think that it's being done to people. Like, people are being played in a way, and they're being played such that their identities are being pitted against one another, and such that like my identity as a queer brown person, right, makes me a threat to them and a threat to this country and a threat to a way of life. And like, none of that is actually true. And I don't think that they would believe it if they hadn't been sold that line by somebody who kept spinning it again and again and again. And so I think that's like that is sort of what forced me to really like try to dig in, is to be like, if the love is real, or it was real, like, then what happened to it? Like, how could that have been replaced by this narrative? And, you know, I think a thing that people don't talk about enough in this country at all is grief. And the fact that so many people in this country are grieving. And particularly in Appalachia and the Rust Belt and in the South, if you are living in a community that once was healthy and is no longer, and there aren't jobs anymore, and the opioid epidemic is ravaging your community, you're grieving. Like, you're grieving the loss of like your home. You're grieving the loss of like health and stability in your community. And grief, if it's unprocessed, it turns into rage really quickly. And I think that that's really what's happened to a lot of people, is that certain politicians like recognize that rage as an opportunity. Because if you're grieving and you're in a place of rage, and I give you someone to blame, you're going to blame them, right? Leaders have choices. They can help us to move through our grief, or they can use our grief as a weapon. And I really think that that's what's happened. And so I guess I sort of felt like, again, like trying to counter that sort of polarizing narrative, which weaponizes our grief and makes it into a thing that we wield against each other. Like, I needed to dig into that grief. I needed to try to understand, like, what is the source of the grief and what is it leading us to do? And so that's what I really tried to do in some of those essays, is try to understand like the causes of the grief. And I think the causes of the grief are real. I don't think they're false. I just don't think that the solve is xenophobia and homophobia and transphobia. Like, that is not going to make your grief go away, even if politicians are telling you that that's going to make your grief go away.
Great. I believe, Neema, you no longer have family living in West Virginia. How do you, we talked about home just a few moments ago. How do you define home? And do you still consider West Virginia such a place?
Yeah, I mean, I was just there 4 days ago, you know, it'll always be home. As long as there are people who live there, or who are people I feel connected to, it will always be home. I think the really beautiful thing about this book journey has been, I would say prior to writing the book, like a lot of my relationships in West Virginia were eroding. They were eroding because people were aging. They were eroding because of political differences. They were eroding because people were leaving. But in the process of writing this book, I've sort of been able to connect with this whole new community of queer Appalachian folks, of Appalachian organizers, of people who are working every day to make Appalachia a place that sort of welcomes everyone. And so in some ways, I feel like I've like discovered home again, with a new community of people who I couldn't see when I was growing up. We couldn't see each other. We didn't know we were there. And now we do. And that's probably been maybe the most beautiful part of this book journey, has been like finding home again in the place that was home to begin with.
Yeah, lovely, lovely. So we talked about grief. Would you say, what would you say that you grieve most, if anything, from your childhood?
I think that the thing that I probably grieve the most is how hard it was for me to figure out who I was, and how the lack of visibility of like models made it just so much harder to like understand who I was, what was happening with me, what it meant for my life. I think it took me, it took me a really long time to figure out who I was, to come out. Like all of those things took. I look at my students now who are having these things happen for them when they're like 15 years old, and I'm like, that's amazing. And that only can happen because there's like multiple generations before you who did a lot of work for us to get to this place. Like, I think that often when I was a kid and I felt like I was on the outside, I assumed it was about race, because race was the most visible marker of difference between me and most of the people who I was around. I think when I look back on it, queerness was as much of a factor, if not more of one, in terms of what was making me feel like I didn't belong, or making it hard for me to understand where I fit. And so I think I grieve that like that process was really hard and took a really long time, and often felt like walking through a forest that's like so thick and dense, like you don't even know how to take the next step because you can't see. That's a hard that I don't really wish on anybody. And I think it's a hard that I wish I didn't have to have either. And I think, I'm on the other side of it now, but I certainly can imagine a reality where like that didn't have to be the case.
Absolutely. It's that thread of truth, that I certainly most connect with. And I think what really resonated with me throughout the wonderful essays in your lovely memoir.
Yeah. Talking about being an outsider, sports can make people feel part of such a wonderful community, but can also be I guess the ground for breeding outsiders. You played basketball as a child. Now, for me, that was a very outsider experience.
Mm-hmm.
So much has been written about the importance of learning teamwork through sports, and so that experience for you, how was that experience for you? Did it prepare you in some way to navigate challenges that you encountered later on, including just sheer determination that it takes to throw oneself into the solitary pursuit of writing?
Yeah, I think it was both things at the same time, right? I found like deep belonging in the context of sports, and I also probably felt the most alone when I was playing sports, because your team might see you as one of them, but then you encounter other teams and the fans from other teams, and they're very quick to pick up on like you not belonging, and making that sort of the thread or the theme of their harassment. And so I think sports always held that duality for me of like, this both has a lot of meaning for me and is incredibly hard. At the same time, I think that so much of who I am as an adult was shaped by those experiences. Mainly, I think the experience of being coached. One of the essays in my book is about my youth basketball coach, who was my coach for 3 years and then like kept me on as his assistant coach even after that. And what I think he really taught me is like what it means to be a mentor to someone, and how mentoring is not about like imparting, wisdom once, but mentoring is really about like being alongside somebody for the long haul. And it's that steady presence over time that really shapes people. And really that relationship as it evolves and grows is the thing that transforms people. And that informs so much of who I am as a teacher and how I think about teaching, which is not, oh, I have you in my classroom for 1 year and we're done, but really like, what does it mean to sort of be in your life and be by your side as you grow and change, and recognize that like a lot of that change, it takes a long time. It doesn't happen in one school year. It happens over the course of your life. And so I think that for me has been the biggest learning from sports, is about like what it means to extend care and be in relationship with young people, because I was lucky enough to have a coach who did that for me.
So I'm going to close this out, Neema, with the following question. How would you say that you've changed as a human and as a writer from the time that you set out to write your memoir to the person that you are now sitting here with us this evening?
So much. I had so much fear when I was writing. I was so frightened all the time of what people were going to think, how they were going to respond. And I think that, freeing myself from that fear of shame is probably like the most transformative thing that's happened to me, is recognizing that like shame exists by and large to maintain the status quo. Shame gets enacted on people by people who have power and don't want to give it up and don't want their ways of being challenged. And understanding that about shame was incredibly freeing, because it allowed me to ask the question of like, well, who is this shame serving right now? What purpose does it serve? Does it serve a purpose of like doing something good, or does this maintain ways of being and acting that are actually really oppressive and that we need to talk back against? I think that was, I'm 43. That might be the biggest learning I feel like I could have had in my life, is that one that came out from here. But I also think that something that I learned from this book process was that people are really hungry for vulnerability. We are living in a time when so much of people's presence is so curated, right? Their online presence is so curated. They only say things that are really carefully curated. They don't want to make mistakes. They don't want to show any vulnerability, show any kind of sense that they could do something wrong. And it kind of makes it impossible for everybody to live, because we're not perfect, and we're not curated, and we're really vulnerable. And so writing this book that was really vulnerable, I just found that every reader met my vulnerability with their own. And that consistently their response was like, this made me feel less lonely, which also made me think people are really lonely. And they need to not feel alone. And writing can do that. If writers make themselves vulnerable, like it creates space for readers to feel less alone. I think that learning is one that's going to stay with me for a really long time, that there's a lot of power in that, and in like helping the people feel less alone in a world that otherwise can feel incredibly lonely.
Oh, Neema Avashia, thank you so much. I so appreciate your grace, your voice as a writer, your vulnerability. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely to be here with you both.
Gentle listeners, until next time, I'm Robert Gwaltney.
And remember, to be creative is to be courageous. I'm Jeffrey Dale Lofton.